Good afternoon and a very warm welcome indeed to our professional learning event looking at the important issue of diversity within the teaching profession in Scotland. My name is Kevin Brack and I'm the Senior Teaching Fellow in Educational Leadership at the University of Edinburgh's Murray House School of Education and Sport. We're delighted to have you here and are looking forward to an excellent discussion about this important topic. This event is being hosted by the University of Edinburgh's Teacher Education Partnership and is part of our commitment to responding to the recommendations of the Teaching in a Diverse Scotland report. This is the first in a series of professional learning events we've planned before the summer, exploring the issue of anti-racist education and diversity in the profession. Future events are going to focus on learning from the stories of minority ethnic teachers, parents and learners. If you're interested in being part of any future panels or future events, please do get in touch either through the Padlet that we've shared today or through my direct email. Now, for the purpose of our panel discussion tonight, I'm going to use the acronym BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, whilst recognising it's an umbrella term which is imperfect. We also want to recognise that whilst we have a diverse panel, the lack of diversity in the profession and the work of anti-racism across the system is an issue for those of us who are white to lead and to address. The session tonight will be recorded as both audio and video for further dissemination. You're very welcome and we encourage you to keep your camera on, but obviously be mindful of the fact we are recording, and please mute yourself unless you're asking a question. You may wish to use the speaker view if you prefer, because you get a better view of us while we're speaking, but you may not want that either. And if you're tweeting tonight, our hashtag is hashtag UOE So UOE as in University of Edinburgh, Teach Ed. I'll put that in the chat as well. Please feel free to use the Padlet throughout the evening. I'll put the link for the Padlet into the chat to ask questions or to make comments, and the chat function will remain open as well. Just a quick reminder for everybody to abide by our values of respect and kindness at all times during the discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel this evening. First of all, Professor Rubina Arshad, CBE, who chaired the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group and is Professor Emerita in Multicultural and Anti-Racist Education at the University of Edinburgh's Murray House School of Education and Sport, where she was also head of school from 2013 to 2019. So thank you for joining us, Rubina. We also have Khadija Mohammed, who is a senior lecturer at the University of the West of Scotland and a founding member of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators, SAMI, and she also served on the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group. Melina Valdelivre is the lead specialist for race equality education Scotland and the co-founder of the Antiracist Educator. Welcome, Melina. And last but not least, we have Sharon Smith, who is QIO for Professional Learning Leadership at Fife Council and previously served as Senior Education Officer at the GTCS, where she was also involved in the Teaching in Diverse Scotland Working Group. So a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here, especially you, Professor Arshad, who could be enjoying your emerita status in any way that you wished. You've chosen to be with us tonight, so thank you very much indeed for that. So before we begin our discussion, just to set the context, I'm sure lots of folk who are here tonight will know the context really well, but just to set it out for everybody briefly, Teaching in a Diverse Scotland was a landmark report which was released in 2018, which looked at the issue of diversity within the teaching profession. The working group was led by Professor Arshad, who authored the original report, and this group published a follow-up report in March 2021, which outlined areas of progress and identified priorities for future work. The report set a target for 2030 that the teaching workforce reflected the wider population in terms of diversity. A year on from the release of the follow-up report, this panel discussion tonight aims to examine the progress made and discusses where more work is required. So we're going to kick off by looking at a really important issue, which is the mutating nature of racism in 2022. So one of the lines that really struck me most when looking again at the working group's follow-up report was that racism has mutated, and that whilst we still absolutely have overt and deliberate racism in our system and in our country, we also have the dimension of microaggressions and unconscious bias. So if I could start with you first, Rubina, and then come to each of our panel members in turn, and just get you to talk a little bit about how racism has mutated, what your thoughts are around that, and what that might look like in the system in 2022. So Rubina, if I can come to you first, and I'll come to the other colleagues after that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin. I think that as you say, it's not the overt. I think all of us know how to deal with the overt. For me, it's the subtle changes in curriculum. That is a really powerful tool, and I think it's one that we haven't used as much as to our benefit as we could do. To do two things, I think. One is to help those who are from minoritized backgrounds to have the confidence to recognize their worth and their identity and their place, but also for the majority young people to also teach them about issues of racism. So how it's mutated, I think, is to become more subtle as far as I'm concerned. I do think that the age-old Scottish chestnut of we're all Jock Tamson's bairns and we're, all that, I think that's still lurking somewhere. The ease that we might say, oh, it happens in England, but not in Scotland, that's kind of still around, and we shouldn't take our foot off the gas. I also think that there might be tensions, I guess. For a long time, people of colour, Black minority ethnic people's voices were just not heard. And now that they are beginning to be heard, there are also other groups which are minoritized, whether they're Gypsy travellers or whether there is white minorities like Eastern Europeans, and we've got to watch that we're not in these competing spaces in a way that is detrimental to each other, that we move forward together, because it's ultimately where we are united. For example, with Gypsy travellers and minority ethnic people of colour is systemic oppression. So we cannot forget those kinds of base as things mutate. That's my starter for 10.
Great, thank you very much, Rubina. Khadija, can I come to you next? How do you see the kind of mutating nature of racism in our system?
Gosh, yes, Kevin, just really to follow on from Rubina's point there, what we deal with from a SAMI perspective when participants join our leadership mentoring programme. So these are BAME, we're using that terminology for this session, teachers who embark on this programme talk about those very subtle covert acts of racism that they experience in the workplace. And this, and oftentimes what they do show us, Kevin, is that they actually, how do I describe it? They demonstrate a capacity to, I suppose, brave some of that racial harm that they experience within classrooms, within staff rooms. And oftentimes you'll see that they're often drawn upon to, so for example, a senior leader might reach out to them and say, can you support me to interpret for a particular parent? Or, can you do X, Y, and Z? But then actually then are overlooked for other aspects, or perhaps then their skills are not valued elsewhere. And so they keep talking about the fact that when they're in a staff room, in fact, one teacher actually, or many actually have described the fact that when they walk into a staff room and if there's a space beside them, sometimes colleagues won't come and sit next to them. And it's something that I or you would be horrified at, thinking, my goodness, does this still happen in 2022? But oftentimes it's also about those social networks that they're excluded from, Kevin, is one thing that they've talked heavily about in our programme. So exclusion from those social networks, the sort of stereotypes that are often still that they are associated with, is something that they're really dealing with time and time again. But I guess there's a whole host of other issues within that, Kevin, when we talk about the survival and the resistance of our BAME teachers within the profession, and I'm sure you'll touch on many of those issues later on, but it's that repeated nature of some of the racism that they experience that has, I guess, it's becoming tiresome, and it's leading to many of them, as we already know, leaving the profession. But I'm sure some of the other issues will come out later on in our discussion, Kevin.
Great, thank you very much. And so dispiriting to hear that is still the case, but absolutely true. And I'm sure that'll come out from our folks' reflections too. Melina, from your kind of viewpoint in terms of your own practice and in terms of your national viewpoint, how do you see this issue of mutating racism?
Thanks, Kevin. I think I'll just build on what Rubina and Khadija said, because there's so much already in there. So from my experience as an English teacher, and then moving on to working with Education Scotland, and I worked with the Antiracist educator before that, I found it helpful thinking about racism in different types of racism. So interpersonal racism, that could be the sort of overt, explicit racism, name calling, graffiti, that sort of thing. But also the smaller, subtle forms of racism, such as racial microaggressions. So in a classroom, that could be a subtle comment about a pupil not being able to do well enough in a certain area because of the color of their skin, or guidance teacher telling them that they shouldn't really be aiming for that career because that's not what their people do. So those sort of comments are really racial microaggressions, but that can lead to internalized racism. So the young person might start believing that about themselves. They're not able to reach their or have the same aspirations as other majority ethnic pupils, for example, if they keep hearing those messages and internalizing them. And that is also how majority white Scottish pupils will be internalizing the racial prejudice, all the negative messages they get through the curriculum or those interpersonal interactions. And what one of those impacts it can have is also the well-being it will affect educators of color, young people of color, children of color, and there's a term we use a lot, racial trauma, to refer to that. So when we're thinking about racism, we should also be thinking about the health and well-being of those who experience racism. And then beyond that, we've got the wider structural, institutional nature of racism. How are institutions responding to serving the needs of those young people who experience racism and those teachers who are experiencing racism? When they raise a grievance, for example, as an educator, are they well supported? What are we doing as an institution to support the needs of educators, children, young people who experience racism?
Great, thank you very much. And I think that point about how those microaggressions and those other aspects are internalized and how that then impacts on well-being is a really, really important factor. Thanks, Melina. Sharon, if I can come to you, what's your kind of viewpoint on this? How do you see this existing in the system currently?
It's difficult for me, Kevin, in a way, because I'm not in school. So at the moment, I'm not actually experiencing any of what's being discussed face-to-face. I'm very isolated in my office at home. But I think for me, the whole part of that isolation, I think, as a result of COVID, I think children and our young people will have been very isolated, and therefore they will have been in their social groups solely and not necessarily have had the opportunities to mix for long periods of time due to the pandemic. And I'm wondering if that will have put barriers in places for conversations or for wider discussions around microaggressions or racist issues that may arise. And I also think that because in schools at the moment things are extremely busy, and this is absolutely no excuse, but I wonder if it's a reason. I wonder if people's default unconscious biases kick in, and actually microaggressions happen without people really considering what's being said and and the actions being taken. And I certainly know from my own learning and talking with other people as well that the professional learning that our colleagues, our teachers in schools require to be able to actually speak out against any microaggressions, whether that's what they're seeing in the classroom or whether it's what they're seeing in the staff room, and confidently be able to articulate why they aren't right is an issue. Currently, just now, I think we're very much more aware of George Floyd, Black Lives Matters, all of the things that have rightly come to our attention, but we need to be able to then now talk about that and then confidently knowing what we're seeing is supporting that anti-racist approach going forward.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So that really links in really well to the next theme that we're going to explore, which is perceptions and misconceptions of both racism and anti-racism out there in the system and in wider society as well. And the follow-up report from March 2021 really picks up on a number of what these misconceptions and perceptions are. And I'm wondering if by talking through what these things are, it might help us frame some of the challenges that we've got to overcome in terms of our work for anti-racism. So Rubina, if I could ask you, first of all, what do you see as some of the major kind of misconceptions that are out there currently, both in society, but also in the education system around this work?
I think possibly it's a real tension, isn't it? I don't know if it's a misconception. I mean, for everyday classroom, for teachers in the everyday, it's the young people in front of them that will be their priority. And so we're dealing at things at a very micro level because we're dealing with individual learners, and that's how it should be. That's not decrying it, but ultimately the macro plays such a part. And I think that with, as Sharon was saying, all the pressures coming to people about COVID and staff cover and things, you know, people don't have the energy to be thinking about the macro. They just have to concentrate in the micro. So for me, that's a challenge, because if we just deal with the micro without acknowledging, as I used to say to my student teachers, you know, the child that's coming to school dropped at the school gate by parent or friend, whoever, and the child that's already woken up at 6:30 because he or she has had responsibility for caring duties or doing a paper round or whatever, will have very significant differences in concentration levels potentially. And so if you don't take account of the macro, that's an issue. But I think for us also, we've got to watch in Scotland that I always remember somebody saying to me that when the refugees, like the Vietnamese boat refugees, first came, and then subsequently more refugees, like into places like Fife and things, people were very, very welcoming. Largely, people care about each other. They want to help. They donate clothing, etc. But very shortly after that, that sympathy level dropped away, and people got fed up of it. Like, oh, what is that issue again, or them again? And I think we've got to, in Scotland, find a way of, now that the anti-racist agenda has come onto the agenda after, gosh, 20, 30 years. How do we keep it on the agenda without people kickbacking and saying, oh, that's pandering to the woke culture or whatever? So I think that's an issue for us in Scotland that we've got to think about, because I think there's a danger that might happen. So I kind of not quite answered your question, but I throw that out there, because the folk who are on this online with us tonight are all people who are interested in the issue. They want to move forward. In a way, we are the converted that are already here. So we need to watch for those, because I think those kickback reactions, I can see it already starting in different corners, not as obviously as in England. Everybody will have noticed this guidance that came out to teachers in England over the last 2 days about how to teach in a way that is not biased and impartial. And you know, and what the heck do they think the profession has been doing all this time? Teachers have grappled with these issues, but that kind of diktat coming out, we're at least not seeing that in Scotland. So I think the teachers in Scotland have far more agency, and you know, and in a way we should be seeing that. So convoluted answer to your question. Thanks
very much. I think there was a number of important points there. Khadija, if I can come to you next about your thoughts around this issue, and I'm wondering from your experience if the perceptions and the misconceptions look different in different parts of the country as well. I'm thinking about the difference between the kind of urban experience in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen compared to kind of more rural parts of the country. What are your thoughts around that?
Just unmute myself, Kevin. Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. In fact, while Rubina was speaking, I was thinking about the number of webinars where I've been speaking to head teachers across Scotland, and again that sort of geographical divide from the urban. And in fact, I was surprised at one session that I was doing, and some of the head teachers said, I asked them, why are you here? Why did you put yourself forward to attend the session? It was called Let's Talk About Race. And they were very honest, Kevin, in their remarks, and the majority of them were saying, we're here for tips. And I actually had to say, you know, talking about racism and equity work knowing some tips aren't going to help much. But they also spoke about the challenges. So maybe that's something to say about their levels of racial literacy. And I know that a lot of the work that Melina and the sort of Building Racial Literacy Design Group have been working on that. But so again, that reminds me of perhaps that lack of language that they have to name and frame the issues if they're just looking for tips. And it's back to that point where Rubina is saying that they're not seeing it from that systemic structural level. It's very much, what am I going to do as an individual? But they also spoke about the fear that they had, Kevin, that they would be willing to have conversations in their school with their leadership team and the wider staff team and the young people for that matter around race. But they were worried about the pushback they would get from their parents. And that was more from the rural schools. So it's almost that almost all white communities thinking this is not something we need to be discussing because we've got no problem here. Right? And actually, it's those very communities that really do need to have those conversations. So there was a lot of misunderstanding around that. And the other thing I wanted to say around the point was that part of the Scottish Government work that Rubina's touched on there, the wider stakeholder group, there's 4 subgroups within that, Kevin, and one's looking at racist bullying. I think, I can't remember the exact title of the subgroup. And even within that, there was conversations around, we tended to assume that a lot of that was taking place from one child to another child. But what we were getting to kind of highlight that actually some of that racism that we experience within schools is a BAME teacher experiences it from a fellow teacher. And it's not just young people. And that we need to address that. Because I don't know, I used to have this naive view that no teacher could cause harm in this area. But clearly, as research tells us and our young people tell us, that it's a case there. But there's a number of issues, within that, Kevin. So, but I'll leave it to there. And I think there's also this misunderstanding around it. Recently, I was in another webinar with our union, and somebody said, we're really addressing this really well, Khadija. We've created a multicultural club. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, please. And I said, we didn't know what to call it, but we decided to call it a multicultural club. And I said, please, if I can give you one piece of advice, don't call it a multicultural club. There's something problematic about that term. And I think I grew up in the 80s, and you think, I grew up with the whole steel bands, saris, samosas rhetoric. And I think it's a lot to do, I blame it for a lot of this. Oh, it's Chinese New Year or it's Ramadan, let's get something to talk about, fasting and so on. And I said, please call it perhaps something to do with maybe, your school's Antiracist club. And this particular teacher said, oh, no, I couldn't do that, Khadija. I just don't like the term anti-racism. And it was just so telling that there was a real misunderstanding of actually what that term means, that you're actually identifying, recognizing and beginning to address it. And the anti-racism work is rooted in action, but there was a real misunderstanding there, Kevin. And I'm sure it's not just in that particular school. Sorry, I go off on a tangent, so I'll stop there.
I think that's a really important point. And I wonder as well if you think about communities, as you say, Khadija, that have very, very small numbers of minority ethnic people in their neighbourhoods, in their communities, or in their school communities. Do you think it is a lack of understanding, or do you think the lack of understanding is so narrow that they've not built that kind of depth of understanding that you described there?
Yeah, Kevin, there will be lots of areas, it's lots of schools where there will be perhaps either it's a large diverse group or a much smaller ethnic group within school settings. And I think the argument really is, we often talk about our children ready for school. And I always kind of turn that and say, well, are the schools ready for the young people to come in? And that's irrespective. Why do we need to wait for the one diverse family to come in before we start asking questions of, is our curriculum fit for purpose? Do we actually have policies that speak to this family that is relevant for them? And then we scurry around looking for, particular things to add or looking for those role models. And so actually it's about having those questions at the centre of everything that we do. And there was a discussion, I had a very brief discussion with Rubina a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if Rubina will remember this term, all learners. We see that in all our policies and our documents. And I'm saying, Rubina, when we talk about all learners, there's an assumption that we make instinctively that it's all white learners. And we need to really unpack that, because that will really help us to make sure that our policies are then fit for purpose, that we're speaking to all learners in terms of whether they've got English as an additional language, whether they come from a diverse ethnic background. So for me, it really is about having that kind of holistic view and not just waiting for the one odd diverse child that comes into our schools that we then have to step up to action. We need to have those policies in place in the first instance.
Absolutely. And I think if that kind of universal approach was taken, they wouldn't get the response that you get sometimes in less urban areas where folk think it isn't an issue because they don't see it right in front of them. So thank you for that, Khadija. Angel, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in just now?
Oh, hang on, sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
So I'm just going to tell you a situation that happened to me today. It's just what you've just said. I'm setting up an anti-racist club. So I thought I'd go to my head teacher, who is actually brilliant, actually. And I said, look, I've got this club. It's called Antiracist. And she said, oh, I don't think that's a very good name. Surely we could be a bit more positive about it. And I was and I said to her, no, actually, it's positive, because this is a positive action we're doing. I will ask the young people that join the group if they want to call it another name. But yeah, so it's just on that line that as myself, it's not being taken positively, the name anti-racist. So yeah.
Thanks very much.
That's what I wanted to say. All right, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Angel. I think that's a very important observation. Melina, could I come to you next? I guess we've kind of set the scene here of what some of the issues are and some of the kind of concerns that we're trying to address. There's been a huge amount of work done, which was recognised in the follow-up report, about trying to close that awareness gap in terms of racial literacy. Do you want to talk a wee bit about some of the work that you've done about anti-racism and building racial literacy across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And thanks, Angel, for sharing that story. Angel is also a member, a participant on the Building Racial Literacy program, and we've got a couple already in the audience, so that's great to see so many people engaged. And yeah, I also had the same issue trying to set up an anti-racist club, but with pupils explaining why they thought anti-racist is actually really important and part of our social justice values. It eventually worked, so don't give up on the term anti-racist. So yeah, just to give you a bit of background on what's going in Scotland, the Building Racial Literacy program is a professional learning program prototype that has been co-constructed with a range of anti-racist organisations, including the Scottish Association for Minority Ethnic Educators, so with Khadija here, and it's part of the wider Scottish Government programme of work looking at race, equality and anti-racism in education. And this first iteration of this prototype programme is really designed to build the racial literacy of educators across Scotland. And what we mean by racial literacy, we're really looking at developing people's understanding of racism. And just to touch on the point about misconceptions about racism, there's still that misconception that racism is really about individual hate and prejudice, and it's usually intentional, and that wider systemic but also endemic nature of racism is misunderstood. There's a misunderstanding that racism is not really an issue in Scotland, it's more an issue in England or in the US, but not really in Scotland. So in this program, we're really trying to raise people's awareness of how racism works in Scotland, uplifting, amplifying those experiences of racism in Scottish education, so that educators become aware of how it can operate, even within their classrooms, often unintentionally because they're unaware. So it's about building their understanding, also building their confidence to practice, and embed anti-racist practice in their behaviours and processes, and build their confidence in racial dialogue. So really building their skills to talk about race with children, with young people, with staff, colleagues, parents and wider communities, because that is such an important skill if we want a fair society for all. And so as part of this prototype program, we wanted to have a range of different perspectives included in the first cohort. So we've We've had nominations through 27 different Scottish local authorities, so all the way from the Central Belt, down to the Central Belt, and all the way up to Orkney as well. So really diverse perspectives from different participants, and participants from early learning and childcare, community learning and development, primary schools, secondary schools, as well as local authority officers, managers, because that's what the Teaching in Diverse Scotland report identified. If we want to increase representation of Black, Asian, minority ethnic teachers in the Scottish profession, then we also need to make sure that local authority officers improve their understanding of how racism operates in Scotland and in Scottish institutions. So yeah, that's a bit of background of the programme, Building Racial Literacy. So far, it's been really interesting through the initial pre-programme survey. So many participants really had focused more on that individual nature of racism, so focusing on hate and prejudice. And now from the induction and a couple of webinars, participants are really beginning to grasp the more systemic nature of racism, and how it's really important to think about what they're doing in their curriculum, their practice, and all the different initiatives that can really support anti-racism, like anti-racist clubs, like anti-racist newsletters, getting parents and communities involved. So loads of great ideas from participants, including loads of participants who are already doing fantastic anti-racist work, and a couple are here as well. So that's the program so far.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for outlining all those amazing things that are happening so far. Sharon, can I come to you next? I wonder, how do you see it from your kind of viewpoint in the system about how far along we are on that journey? We've obviously made a great start in terms of a lot of the work that Melina's outlined there. Where do you see us currently in terms of that journey towards closing the kind of awareness gap of anti-racism and its importance in our system?
Interesting question, Kevin. When Khadija came on, she went, "Oh, here we are again. How long are we going to be talking about this?" And how long's a piece of string? I think depending on which local authority you're working in, you to get a different response to that across Scotland, and also within schools within each of these local authorities as well. I think for me, I'm very embedded in the importance of this work, but actually for me as well, there's doing it right and doing it well, because we can be very, very well intentioned, but equally be disastrous in the consequences that might happen in the classroom, because we want to talk about race, or we want to talk about slavery, for example, and actually all we do is marginalise further. So for me, it's really important that we actually take small steps, but really deep embedded steps to really understand, to learn, to be more racially literate, to be able to be confident in having these conversations, to be able to support our learners in the learning and the discussions that happen in school. So I think there's an awful long way to go. And actually that whole systemic approach is really, really important. We can't just do it in our classrooms. It needs to come from the top down as well as from the bottom up. And we need to be listening to the voices of our children and young people. We need to listen to the voices of those with lived experiences and actually learn about how we can really tackle that endemic racism and take forward that anti-racist approach. So, I think there's still loads to do, Kevin. I really do. And actually, whilst we have a group of people who are really taking this forward, people come and go and things change and roles change, and it's really keeping this conversation on the table is really important. And it has to be within our priorities and local authorities. It has to be visible. It's all right to talk about trust and respect, but let's put the words in our policies that actually we want to be talking about actually having anti-racist approaches. We want to have equality and diversity in our, as Rubina said in her starting conversation about mission statements, we need to be leading with these really centre on the table for us, so that we know exactly that is our priorities going forward. And I think we're quite a way away from that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Rubina, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm going to say something which may well be controversial. I think that in a way the field has gone ahead of initial teacher education. I do think, I'm going to say this as an ex of a school of education, and I know there are people on this call that are also from IT, so they may want to chin. I do think that it needs to start there. And it's fine for study and it's fine for professional learning to deepen the understanding subsequently, because we all continue learning all of our lives. But initial teacher education needs to really step up from first gear to fourth gear pretty quickly, because I actually think the field is now leading in this area, and the IT are on a major catch-up. I'm not saying all, but I think overall it is. So that would be the provocation I'm going to put on the table.
Great, thank you. Folks, if you want to respond to anything that any of the panel members have said, please feel free to either put that into the chat or to raise your hands, and we'd love to hear your experiences as well, because I think quite a few of the folk who are on the call are, as Rubina says, in the field and are seeing some of this practice up close and firsthand. So I think it's really important to hear your voices too. So if you do want to contribute either through the chat or through raising your hands, please feel free to do that. Don't feel like you're interrupting our flow at all, because we're very happy to hear from you. So Rubina, I think that point really links really well to the next theme I wanted to look at, which was thinking about the difference between plans and positive actions, and the kind of tensions between plans and positive actions. Because I think the follow-up report from March of 2021 outlines a huge amount of work that's happened across the system at national level in terms of creating policies and plans and approaches around this important work. But there's less evidence of positive action being taken by local authorities, by national organisations, and also at school level too. Could you kick us off, Rubina, and just share your kind of perspective on that in terms of, are we getting the balance right between plans and positive action? If we aren't getting the balance right, what do we need to do in terms of kicking into action with more urgency?
I think that at leadership level in local authorities and in initial teacher education, I think we could explore the Equality Act a bit more, Equality Act 2010, to see what is allowed and what's not allowed. And I haven't done enough of what could be allowed under law. So when I was head of school, I wanted to ensure that
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your sound's gone a little bit awry there. Would you mind turning your camera off and see if that helps with the audio?
Is this better?
Slightly. Do you want to try again?
Yes. I don't know if it'll get any better.
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So when I was head of school, I wanted to diversify the students coming in to Murray House, and I wanted to put positive action measures in place, which is allowable under law, to get more men into primary teaching, more women into science, but also more Black multi-ethnic people generally. And I think that all of us, whether at local authority or ITE, can do more about looking at what legislation enables us to do to actually close the underrepresentation gap. And I don't think we've done enough. And I think we each need to be identifying for our specific areas what is possible. So that would start. The problem, I think, is that lawyers within local authorities and the legal teams within universities are very cautious. So you need to actually work with lawyers who have understanding of equality legislation and really push back on the computer says no mentality, which I think a lot of establishments tend to come back with.
Absolutely, and certainly something I would recognise from my own practice as well. And I think a lot of colleagues have grappled with this tension between positive action and positive discrimination. And like you say, a lot of organisations immediately go into safety mode and don't allow other colleagues to explore what's possible through positive action. And some really good examples in the report about Glasgow City Council taking positive action in terms of recruitment of support assistants that eventually got opportunities to become early years practitioners, and some work around building temporary contracts for principal teacher posts as well. But that's a drop in the ocean compared to the 32 local authorities and the lack of positive action that has perhaps been taken. So anybody else want to come in on that issue? Khadija, did you want to share something?
Yeah, Kevin, just again, Rubina's really highlighted the key issues there. I'm thinking of positive action in many ways, and you touched on the roles at Glasgow City Council. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll go on to ITE, because that's something that I'm particularly interested in and critical of. The Glasgow City Council posts, and that's something I'm sure Melina can come in as well at any point, because it's something that we've both raised time and time again, that when those posts were ring-fenced, Kevin, I think there needed to be some groundwork done as well, and prepare for potential pushback, because many of our BAME teachers who were quite positive about the roles, some were actually quite reluctant to put themselves forward. And they were reluctant because of the possible implications that they might face if they're talking to their fellow white colleagues, and some of them did, as in, that's interesting, why isn't that post available to me to apply? So that lack of understanding around positive action, but also, so they were facing some of that pushback within the staff room, and they were trying to kind of distance themselves from it. Some were saying, gosh, no, I don't want a step up, Khadija, because that's how they saw it. It was like a step up. Someone's giving me a hand up, and so it's this whole meritocracy debate. I want to get there on my own merit. And so when we talk about also just the whole racial literacy and understanding the issues around the challenges of BAME teachers, Kevin, it goes beyond just talking to our white teachers, and Melina has very skillfully included that within the Building Racial Literacy programme, because within that we need to also build the racial literacy of our BAME colleagues. It doesn't necessarily mean because you are from a Black and multi-ethnic background that you are racially literate. I know many of our teachers who have perhaps been born and raised in Scotland, Kevin. They've been through our schooling system in Scotland, and we know what our curriculum is like. I know myself, I never ever had conversations around race and racism in our curriculum and so on. I essentially tried to play white all my school life. And so therefore, when I was suddenly faced with this idea of who am I really, and how does my identity as a teacher in a school really challenged me to think about my pedagogy. And that happened years back when 9/11 took place, and the young people were saying things like, Mrs. Muhammad, did you see what the Muslims did? And I had to actually say to them, right, let's have a conversation about this. And I said to them, I didn't wear my hijab at the time, Kevin. And I said, does my name give you a clue as to what faith I follow? And suddenly it was, oh my goodness, you're a Muslim. And then they followed that by saying, but you're different. You're not like them. You're just like us. And I wanted to unpack that and say, so what does that mean that I'm just like you? And it really pushed me as a teacher to think about that, because in my teacher training, I never had discussions about my identity development. No one talked to me we talked about what does being a teacher mean, right? But we didn't really dig deeper into that identity development and how I have these multiple repertoires to my identity and how they impact on how and what I will teach and my lived experience and how that plays within that. And so therefore, I was really challenged. I went on to do my master's, and my dissertation was called Who Am I? I was getting to know me. And so in ITE, Kevin, we also face this issue where we know that there's a handful of BAME teacher educators across Scotland. And Rubina did some really powerful work when she was in a leadership role at Murray House. And I always say this, and I'm not saying this because Rubina's here, and I commend Rubina, and she's been a wonderful mentor for me for so many years, and I'm still not letting her. She's retired, but she's still not. I still call her. She's a lifeline, like David is for me. And actually, what we really need to think about, Kevin, is the racial literacy of our teacher educators, right? Because if they're looking at the curriculum within that white racial frame, right? We're doing our students a disservice. Not just our BAME students, all our students a disservice, because we're sending them out without the capability of beginning to address these issues that we are now having a discussion around. So there are real implications. I've kind of lots of questions here. In what ways are we equipping our educators to do that? In what way are we supporting our student teachers? Talking about placement, our student teachers go out to placement. Some of our BAME students face very subtle, covert acts of racism from their fellow mentors in school. and they end up failing placement, and they're not understanding why they're failing placement. I've actually gone out to do subsequent visits and I wondered why they've been in that position when they should have passed in the first place. Rubina has been very brave in calling that out, you know, within the partnerships that Murray House was with. When I suggested that a couple of years back, I was told, my goodness me, we can't do that, Khadija. We can't call that out for the sake of partnerships. Well, I think we need to be bold. And I think we need to start having those conversations with schools where we're able to challenge and say there's an issue here and we need to discuss it. Otherwise, our students on placement will continue to experience racism and fail. And so therefore, they're not even started that career ladder in teaching and they're already leaving. Sorry, Kevin. I always go off on a tangent to bring me back. Apologies.
Thank you. No, I think there were very powerful reflections for us. Melina, did you want to come in on that point?
Sure, thanks, Khadija. Yeah, there's been so much to think about in terms of positive action, supporting those educators who are thinking about applying for posts where there is positive action, also after they've gained those promoted positions, the pushback they might face, any stigma around that. So lots of really important things to think about, and also provocation, thinking about which educators of colour are benefiting the most from positive action, because obviously BAME is not one homogenous group. There's a lot of anti-blackness, lots of other different types of racism within that bigger frame. So positive action is a really important step forward, but we have to be very critical about how we're using it. So I can give you the example of building racial literacy as a professional learning program that we've been developing. We wanted to make sure that we recruited enough Black, Asian and minority ethnic educators to make sure that the program itself does not replicate any structural barriers for Black, Asian and minority ethnic educators. In other words, if only white educators received this professional learning, went on this professional learning program, got it on their CVs, and then applied for all these different diversity jobs, then we would actually be creating a structural barrier for those educators of colour who wouldn't have benefited from this program. So we have recruited 26 participants of colour from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds out of the 80 plus participants we have. And so far it seems to have really worked well. One of our participants has just received a secondment in a local authority as an EAL education officer, which includes in her job title diversity in learning and teaching, and that's a job I've never heard of before. So perhaps that's also because of the national influence. There is more people are talking more about this, it's being prioritized, and that's having a knock-on effect in all the different local authorities. So that is a sign that it is having an impact. Perhaps the Building Racial Literacy program had an impact, but we still have a lot of work to do as well. So keeping those critical questions as to who is benefiting from these opportunities, who is not being disadvantaged as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. This discussion seems to be resonating for quite a few folks. Some really interesting things in the chat as well. Asif, do you want to come in next?
Hi everyone, I'm Asaf. I'm PT Languages at Dunfermline High, and I'm the chair of the EIS Anti-Racist Subcommittee, but I'm here in a personal capacity tonight. And I just wanted to make a comment about Glasgow, since that's been that issue's been raised and the affirmative action that's been going on there has been discussed. And obviously the work that's been going on there in Glasgow is really interesting, and it's absolutely legitimate that it's getting attention and it's getting interest. But for me, actually, what's perhaps even more worthy of credit from Glasgow is work that they did several years before that. So in Glasgow City Council, they did a piece of research amongst their BAME teachers and white teachers about their experiences, and that was included as an annex in the Teaching in a Diverse Scotland report in 2018. And that research, that attempt to understand the experiences of BAME teachers as compared to white teachers, was what informed what came next in Glasgow. So one of the really striking things that came out of that report was that BAME teachers said, I think half the percentage of BAME teachers as compared to white teachers had said that a colleague had encouraged them to go for promotion, which is one of the reasons why it then fed on to looking at principal teachers being appointed in Glasgow. So I think that's really important to point out that there are some local authorities in Scotland that are proactively going out of their way to understand the issues and research the issues. And there seems to be quite a yawning gap between what's going on in some places and the approach or lack of approach being taken in other local authorities.
Thanks, Asaf. And I think that definitely reflects one of the major issues that we've got in terms of the fact that some areas of the country have a boldness or are willing to have a boldness around taking positive actions, and others don't seem to have that level of commitment. So thanks for raising that. Khadija, do you want to come back on that point?
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, I was pausing because I thought Sharon's hand was up first. Sharon, do you want, should I go? Okay. I wanted to say something, Kevin, because I'm just recognising some of the names on the call, and they are colleagues from Initial Teacher Education. And I wanted to just to do a big kind of plug here that I know that interviews are taking place for ITE places. And I have had a stream of BAME students contacting me, as my role within ITE at UWS, but also as in my SAMI hat on, and they're looking for just some words of wisdom, some guidance around. I've got an interview, Khadija. Is there any pointers that you can give me? And I'm really anxious, I'm really nervous. Some of them have applied twice, 3 times and have been unsuccessful. And they kind of get that really bland feedback of, we had real competition, it was good, but nothing really concrete to get their teeth into. And I just wonder, given the fact that we've had Rubina's reports, we talk about ITE, we talk about recruitment into teaching for our BAME students. And yet, what happens when they come for an interview and then they get rejected? What are we doing? What advice are we giving them? And actually, what questions are we asking at interview? I recently looked at a sample of questions that we ask within our interviews, and some of them, honestly, are so power-laden. There was one I came across that asked students, as teachers have to plan, organise, blah, blah, blah. Convince me that you'll be able to do this. Convince me? And I want to ask, who am I? I wouldn't want to ask a student that question, because that suggests to me this whole layer of power in there. And then we're also making assumptions about other things that we use with them. So let's take stock and think about those questions, but think about, why are we turning down the very few BAME students that are coming forward? They meet the criteria, they're coming in with what we're expecting, so they get to the interview stage, something happens at that interview stage. And Rubina's unpacked that a lot, many times, but we're still getting them this. And then they text me saying, interview went really well. Then about 2 weeks later, they come back and say, I didn't get in. And then you're sitting, what is happening? And so I think we really need to take stock and think about that within teacher education as a team, sitting down, looking at who are we interviewing and what are we doing about these numbers. I'll stop there, Kevin.
Thank you. Sharon, is it okay if I go to Rubina next, just on this ITE topic, and I'll come back to you after that? Rubina, do you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say that actually one of the things that is really powerful, I think, that came out of the work of the group was that we now have data. So the Scottish Government have agreed to compile data, because data is important. That's what Asaf was saying. He talked about qualitative data that they had from Glasgow's research, which then allowed them to move in action. So the data tells us from 2015 to 2019, BME applicants in Scotland are much less likely to secure a place in ITE. If you're white, 50% of white applicants are not offered places. 67% of applicants of BME background are not offered places. This goes on. Qualifying rates are not as bad, but then we move on to post-probationer employment rate, and I do want to bring this in because I think this is a worrying figure. 86% of probationers overall find employment, but only 75% of BME find employment. So something's going on there because they're on temporary contracts and stay at that level. And finally, 84% of probationers are still in employment 3 years on, but of the BME group, only 70% are still in employment 3 years on. So data is powerful because it actually helps us to start thinking about what on earth is going on here. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Rubina. And that is the issue of data, and what kind of data we have is something we're going to come to very shortly as well, in some more detail. Sharon, do you want to come in just now?
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, it was just back to Asaf and his comment really about that, hearing the voices of BAME colleagues and that research. There are real challenges with the data. So we know that there's issue that the group raised that we didn't have the data that we required to be able to measure the way we wanted to measure in the working group. But in local authorities, it's also an issue as well, because if you have a very small cohort or group of BAME colleagues, teachers working in Scottish schools, the data will not recognise the numbers. When there's such a small group in some local authorities, it doesn't give you actually the correct information you need. But there's definitely something that needs done about that, and certainly that needs addressed, that action taken to hear the voices of our colleagues and experiences to help get the support for us to work strategically to make a difference, to actually address some of the issues. But also even the interview processes, it's absolutely crucial, and these conversations. So that the notion of positive action is really important, in the sense that yes, we have to do the best we can to recruit, but actually the positive action also has to be taken within these strategic groups to be able to identify the work that we need to do and to be able to address these barriers that are obviously existing there. Why aren't our probationers or our student teachers getting into these places? Why are we not recruiting BME probationers at the same rate that we are our white probationers? What's stopping that? And actually addressing the bias that's clearly there, to be able to then put on the table, to make it more equal for everybody. So there's lots of work required there. Equally, Khadija talked about the IT students going into schools on placement and having to respond to that push, horrible microaggressions happening to them, failing placements as a result of being BAME. And actually that's not okay. So where in our schools is that going wrong? What's happening? What's happening with our middle leaders? What's happening with our classroom teachers, our middle leaders and our senior leaders that are actually not dealing with it properly? So it's not, I agree that we need to be working on ITE. I agree that our curriculum in ITE needs to support these conversations, as well as our recruitment processes. But actually there needs to be that sort of school leaders and down approach to narrow the gap, so that actually it's a holistic approach taken to support our BAME colleagues and the recruitment of BAME colleagues in schools. Thank you, Sharon. Helen, do you want to come in?
Hi, thank you. Because I work in ITE, so I've been sitting here going, ah! So there's a couple of things and questions I have, I suppose, but coming on from the last speaker, and I'm sorry, I don't know people's names and I'm looking in different directions. Whenever we want to improve anything within the education system, and maybe it's just because I happen to be in ITE now as opposed to school, I always feel ITE gets it in the neck. Do you know what I mean? So, and it doesn't work. If you try to improve a system by focusing on one part of the system and not all parts of the system, then you just move the problem. It's like watching an air bubble go through. So it does have to be holistic across a whole system, which generally means it has to be slower because there's more work to be done across. And I'm not speaking from any kind of level of experience here other than teaching in schools, teaching in ITE, being English. So the questions were about so somewhere in the chat there was about funding, and I think it was Rubina saying they put funding in for non-white applicants. And I've been in a session with Canadian colleagues who are Indigenous scholars and work with Indigenous peoples, and so they use the phrase non-white, which I find an easier term, but others may disagree, and rightly so, because I'm not an expert. But the funding thing was quite interesting, because somebody else then said it paid for childcare and the costs of doing the course. And so it's about intersectionality. And I don't understand how we take account of that, because the students I meet that could come on the course if there was funding, it tends to be because of poverty or because of child costs. Do you see what I mean? So I don't know how that works. How do we take account of intersectionality in this? As somebody who interviews, and I'm in maths, so we're a shortage subject, so don't quote me. We'll interview anybody who meets the minimum standards to get to interview, but we don't always pass everybody at interview. But I would hope that's not because of the colour of their skin, ever. But if there are structural barriers, what are they? Because I may not see them. So when somebody else talked about the interview question saying, convince me how you'd be able to plan and organise and deal with the time pressures of being a student teacher, I wouldn't have recognised saying the phrase convince me as having a racial bias. I can see it being difficult for all interviewees, but I can't see it as a racial bias. So people see things differently, and I may not see the structural barriers. And then there's the bit about affirmative action that the speaker was talking about in Glasgow. What affirmative action can we take in ITE in terms of encouraging more people to apply? And obviously that applies to me because I'm maths, and anything that gets more people to apply is a good thing. So yes, I've rapid on, but fascinating stuff. But I do think we need to work within the system as a whole, because part of me says I look at the maths curriculum and people talk about decolonizing the curriculum, and I actually don't know what that means. I think I know what it means, and I can see what it might mean in terms of the history that we look at and broadening that, or I might see it in terms of the research that educational researchers do. Do you see what I mean? So I have more questions than answers. Sorry, I'll shut up.
I think some very important points there, Helen, and hopefully we'll pick up some of these points and some of the later themes we're going to talk about this afternoon too. Sheila, do you want to come back in on that point around ITE?
Well, it's a kind of development of the ITE point, but it's not really. So I completely agree with Helen that it's system change in all parts of the system that's needed, not just one part. And the reason I wanted to come in was because it is about data, but data includes people's stories. And today we've been joined by a colleague of mine whose name on the screen is Arnold, but her real name is Sonka Bebe. And I think this is the first time that Sonka has been in any network like this since she came to Scotland. And the thing that really vexes me, Sonka's given me permission to say this, and I'm going to ask her to speak in a minute if that's right with Kevin, is that she was a school leader. She was a head teacher in Zimbabwe and came here as a refugee and had to fight to get into education as a teacher. And I've watched that fight that she's had and the racism and the microaggressions that she's experienced. And it just vexes me that within Scotland, not only do we have people who are applying, as Khadija says, and are not getting in, but we have people who are experienced teachers and they are not gaining access to the system. And then when they get into the system, then they are not respected for their leadership, and that is not used in the way that it could be. So Kevin, is it all right to ask Sonka if she would say what that's been like?
Yeah, sure. Welcome, Sonka. You
can. Good evening, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be in this forum tonight. It's been a little bit tough. It's through the help of Sheila, I'm here. And through her help, I was able to get into teaching, really. I came here in 2006. I applied for teaching posts. I couldn't get any. I even applied for, support for learning, people support learning posts. I couldn't get any. When I applied for those, I was told, oh no, you are too educated for these. You can't get into this. But I was not even given the teaching posts themselves. And I went through an organization, which was a refugee organization. I can't remember the name. I don't know whether Sheila, you recall the name of that organization.
It was Rights, Refugees and Teaching in Education Scotland.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. And when I told them that I was applying for people support posts and I was not being taken in, they were really surprised that I was being given the excuse that you are too educated for this one, you can't take it. And they said that was completely out of place. So I did continue applying. And luckily, this organization was able to put me in, I would say, a school where I did some teaching a bit, though unpaid. I did that for a number of years. And then I also went to a school where Sheila was head. And through her, I was able to advance. And after about 4 years, I again was lucky enough to get the registration, because the requirement had been that I should have a Scottish degree. I don't know what that meant, I don't know. So I had to go back to university. I did social science there. And then when I did social science, I then applied for a registration through the GTC. And they said I should go through the alternative route, which is 300 and something days of teaching. So I was lucky to have Sheila, who took me into her school whenever there was a placement where I could do the teaching. So I made most of my hours there, though initially I had to go through the usual, 1 day, 2 days of, supply teaching, trying to add up the days until Sheila was able to have sort of a longish supply post. So I went there, and that's where I finally got the registration. And having got the registration, because, what Sheila had given me was a temporal post. So I had to find another post somewhere else. And that wasn't easy. I initially found a 3-month post in a very nice school, but they didn't have the permanent post. So I had to apply. I applied until about beginning of the school year, having no post at all. I ended up having to go to Aberdeen because I wasn't being given posts here. I did get a post in Aberdeen, and when I came back after about 2 weeks, West Lothian had suddenly had posts, I would say. I'm saying suddenly because I didn't understand why. I'd been applying initially and there'd been no posts all around Edinburgh. And then suddenly the posts came up. I went to a school, a nice school again. And all this, when I say a nice school, it's all about the leadership. When the leadership is nice, the school becomes nice. But when the leadership is not that nice, everything just falls apart. So I had, let me say, 3 or so consecutive schools of good leadership. And then the 4th school I went to was just disastrous. That's the time when I thought, well, maybe this is not the way to go. Maybe teaching is not the way to go here in Scotland, because I had been a teacher since I was 17, because I started off as a temporal teacher. And, coming in and being told that you are not able to do the job, and the reasons being given most of the time very, you couldn't put a finger to them. As a teacher yourself, having taught for so long, when you've not done your job, it's very easy to tell. But when you're told you're not doing your job, yet you are receiving positive comments from the pupils themselves and from the parents and from other staff members who see what's happening, it becomes really, really tough. It wasn't an easy one because I had to go up to the tribunal, and because Sheila, I've got sons who are very good in using their heads to think. That one of my sons had to go up with me to the tribunal while he was still training as a lawyer, which was really sad, very sad for him. It's something he will never forget, because he still asks me all the time, how are you doing? You really, if I sort of sometimes maybe have a bit of a negative comment about what's going on, he'll ask you, Mom, please, is there anything wrong? Are you okay? And just last week, he was saying to me, I think, Mom, there was a time when I thought you were going to call me and say I've resigned. That's how tough it is. So it's not really easy. And it's all about the school atmosphere. It's what happens in the school. Because you, as a teacher, I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying I'm the best teacher, but sometimes you can obviously tell that I'm not doing that bad. But you are labeled as someone who is not able to do things. I'm very keen on, I'm someone who is very, very keen on climate change. I've done a lot of courses on those. But you find, when it comes to, maybe staff development pertaining to that, you're sort of not in the, you're not given that chance to be, to staff develop anyone, because I don't know whether it's the intonation, because I've been told, sometimes your intonation is too strong, which I'm not really sure of, because we all have different intonations, isn't it? So there are things like that. So sometimes when you, having been a head teacher, when you think of putting yourself forward for headship or for any other post, you begin to ask yourself, people are going to judge me by the way I talk before I even say anything, by the way I look before I even say anything. So it becomes really tough for you to put yourself forward. And it's also tough for me to convince my own children to go into teaching because of the experiences I'm telling them. Because I come home, I have to, say something and to say, this is what is happening. And also sometimes it's not only about me, it's also the experiences themselves are getting from teachers. So this is a very, very quite, it's a big subject, really. And for you to do this, I think it's very commendable. I wish maybe you could invite people who are, the holistic, demography of teaching is needed in this, because if only you are addressing it from maybe the Edinburgh University perspective and not addressing it from the teachers who are in the field, from the leaders who are in the field, then maybe we are not looking at it holistically. Because I would like to, I'm very, very encouraged to hear that Glasgow is really doing something about it. If I can tell you that I've applied for Edinburgh posts since 2012, but I've not had any positive feedback from the City Council. I've applied to Edinburgh specifically looking at schools where there are Black, where there are ethnic minority children, because I wanted to be that example to say, here I am, you can be a teacher too, but I've not been given that chance. And for me, it comes to, is it because maybe I'm going to see what's happening in the schools? They don't want me there because I'm going to see what maybe is happening. It's just a question which I'm pondering over, and I hope that's not the case. I'm sorry really to present sort of a negative, it's not really negative, because we do have people who are really keen, people like you, people like Sheila who have helped a few of us to be here. And I wish there could be more of your kind, really. But really, it's not negative. It's the honest truth of what is taking place. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sonkan. I don't think we could have asked for a better representation of the barriers that folk are facing in our system. I'm really sorry that that's happened to you and that you've experienced what you've experienced in our system. So hopefully some of the work that we're talking about and the work that we want to take forward is going to try to address some of those unacceptable barriers that you've faced in your career so far. So thank you so much for sharing that story with us. So we've only got about 10 minutes left in our discussion tonight. So I want to pick up on a few last kind of main points to discuss. And what Sonka has just shared with us really sets up well this last part of the discussion. And it's really looking at what are those barriers. So what are both the structural, the macro and the micro barriers that folk are facing in the system, both in terms of how we make teaching an attractive career, how we retain and support Black and minority ethnic teachers once they're in the profession, and also the crucial issue that a lot of my work is centred on, which is around access to promotion and the pipeline towards headship as well. So I wonder if we could start with our panel and just talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we've seen in our own work and we see within the system in terms of attracting teachers into the profession, retaining and supporting, mentoring and supporting and sponsoring, and how we open those doors to promotion in a more effective way. Rubina, did you want to start us off?
I think somebody's already said something. I think Sonka actually also talked about leadership. And I do think it starts there, whether you're in ITE or whether you're in a school or whether you're in a local authority or a head of a regional improvement collaborative or whatever your job is, really, whatever your role is. If you're in a leadership position, I think you've got to set the tone and I think you've got to hold to it. So I did have an email last week or the week before from a colleague in another university where the student had experienced racism on placement and they wanted advice about what to do. And I can remember, as Khadija had already mentioned, I remembered one of our students going through that and a member of staff saying to me, what can we do? And basically supported the member of staff to go and speak to the head teacher, but also having the courage to say to the local authority, I'm not sending any more students to this school in your authority unless you sort it out. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues said, oh, placements are really scarce. You can't turn down placements. Oh, yes, you can. You've got to have the leadership courage to say no, and these are the reasons why not. So I think leadership for me is one way that we can start changing the culture and the tone. And similarly, to have a zero tolerance on issues of racism, whether it's in your school, on your campus or whatever, and being prepared to be an unpopular person, because if you go against the grain, that is what will happen. You'll be unpopular, but there will be equally lots of people who will support you, and they'll come out of the woodwork when they have given the courage to do so. They will. So for me, that's where it starts, really. I know a lot gets placed on leaders, but unfortunately, that is a space that we're occupying, and as somebody said to me, we may not always occupy that space. So if you're in that space, use your positional authority.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rubina. Khadija, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry, Kevin, I was just trying to unmute. Gosh, yeah, absolutely, Kevin. So many barriers. And I know that we've touched on ITE, so I'll not go there, but even just from some of my research, Kevin, of BAME teachers across Scotland, there was one particular incident that really took me, and that was, it was a number of principal teachers, and one was from she was in pastoral care and has been looking for promotion for almost 15 years within her own school. 15 years is a long time to move up the ladder there. And she talked about, in fact, she used a term which really I really grappled with. She talked about professional grooming, Kevin. And she said that by not being part of those social networks in school, you know, when you don't go for the drink on a Friday evening after school, right? Because she's Muslim, she doesn't drink alcohol, so she doesn't want to be in that environment. And perhaps for the leadership team to think, well, can we find another place where she could still come along with us, feel comfortable, because in a pub environment, she had experienced some racist issues from the wider public. But beyond that, what happened was, she said, they have these discussions about, you know, what opportunities are there for next for them. And she'd applied for a post, an internal post in her school. And it was an acting assistant head, or I think something similar. Very, very promising application process. Interview came back quite positive, but didn't get it. And when she asked for feedback, she was told that she didn't have enough strategic leadership. Okay, although she's called upon to do X, Y, and Z within the school. Now, if your own head teacher is not prepared to give you that strategic leadership, then you don't really stand a chance. But what actually happened was, it gets better, Kevin. The individual who got the post was external to the school, but this individual freed up an acting maths PT post. And there was a teacher within the school looking for that step up to do an acting PT maths post. And this particular teacher took up that post. Yeah. So do you see how that network is working in there? And so she referred to that as professional grooming, and something that I am excluded from, and I don't get those opportunities. And there was a number of other things said there, but equally there's another challenge, Kevin, and that is of those who are, we do have people. So she's a leader, she's in the senior management team as a PT, but we have other BAME leaders within schools, right? But the challenge they face, Kevin, is that they're less likely to disrupt the status quo. They're less likely to ask questions about, so, you know, why don't we have a policy that supports our EAL children, or whatever, for fear of the implications that might block any further promotion. Yeah, watch this one. This one's trouble because they're asking too many questions. It's almost like what you just said there, Sonka, that actually, if I go into a school, are they worried about what you might spot that's perhaps missing, right? And actually what we're doing, Kevin, is if we are encouraging, we cannot simply, I think what I'm trying to argue, I've made this point before in another session, that we cannot simply graft our Black leaders onto processes and practices that are either fundamentally opposed to where they are coming from, and ignore what they bring culturally, because by doing that, what we're doing is we're denying them and the schools that they serve the opportunity to become outstanding leaders. Yeah, and then we go back to that vicious circle of scouring around for Black role models, right? And what we're doing is we're robbing our young children of the chance to bring their multiple identities, because essentially what we're doing is we're saying to our teachers as well, our BAME teachers, leave your language and culture at the school front door. Fit in and you'll do well. But as soon as you start asking, why isn't our curriculum an anti-racist curriculum, or how are we engaging with our BAME parents, you're seen as problematic. So many challenges, Kevin, but I'll stop there because I know you're conscious of time.
Thank you so much, Khadija. And that really sets up the next kind of big theme that we want to look at in this series of professional learning events, which is really centering the voices of BAME children, young people, staff, and parents as well. So the next three events that we've got are themed around hearing the stories of BAME colleagues in schools who are teachers and other staff, of BAME children, young people, and of BAME parents as well. So I kind of plea to you before we close tonight, if you have got, if you yourself or you've got other friends or colleagues who'd like to be involved in being part of the panel for those sessions, please do get in touch with me. It's kevin.brackett@ed.act.uk. I'll put it into the chat as well, because we'd really like to hear some different voices. And I think, you know, that really resonated with me, Sheila, when you said it's the first time that you, Sonka, have been in such an event as this since you came to Scotland a number of years ago. So we really want, there's so many folk out there that we don't hear from and we don't hear their voices. So it's really important we do hear that. So if you are interested in being involved in future events, please do get in touch with me. Now, this event, as I said, was recorded, so it's going to be released as a video and also as a podcast as well, because we really want to get the messages that we've discussed today out to the wider system beyond this room. So thank you very much indeed to our panel for being part of this event this evening. Thank you very much to our audience who've been absolutely brilliant in terms of how you've engaged and interacted with some of these really important topics. So thank you very much. Please do get in touch if you want to be part of future events. Keep your eye on Twitter for the announcements and the links for signing up for the future events over the course of the next couple of months. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great evening.